The heat arrived that October like the open door of a kiln, not a furnace, but a kiln, the kind that does not merely warm but transforms, and everyone who had lived in the Cedar Bow Valley long enough said they had never felt anything like it in the harvest month, had never watched the creek beds go white and cracked at a time of year when the persimmons should be swelling fat and the fields should be breathing cool. The community hall in the town of Harwick was full that Tuesday evening, packed with farmers and processors and the men from the regional poultry cooperative whose suits were damp at the collar despite the ceiling fans working themselves to a wobble overhead. They had all come because they were desperate, and because there was one person in the valley who was not. She stood at the far end of the room near the window, her hands at her sides, and the crowd watched her with an expression that had once been contempt and had curdled slowly over 8 months into something that felt uncomfortably close to need. Maren Aldecoa was 34 years old. She had been in Cedar Bow Valley for 8 months, and she owned the only healthy flock of heritage breed turkeys in 4 counties. The man from the cooperative, whose name was Fulton Greer, and whose handshake was warm and whose teeth were bright, and who had once called her purchase an act of innocent folly, stood at the front of the room with a clipboard and a proposal and a practiced expression of shared concern. He was talking about consolidation, about emergency acquisition, about how the cooperative could manage the resource for the good of the community. The room was watching Maren. Maren was watching the window. The land, as old Benedicta Soros had told her, always speaks first. The only question is whether you are quiet enough to hear it. But to understand what Maren was listening for, and what she had heard over 8 patient, laughed-at, bone-weary months, you have to go back to the last week of February, when the county road from the interstate passed through 3 inches of old gray snow, and a woman drove a truck she had borrowed from a cousin into Cedar Bow Valley for the first time, with everything she owned in the bed and a folded newspaper auction listing on the passenger seat. She had been a line manager at a frozen foods facility in the eastern part of the state for 11 years, and she had not been unhappy exactly, but she had been precise in a way that a straight line is precise, and she had begun to feel at 33 that precision without destination was just another word for standing still. When the facility restructured and offered severance packages, she accepted hers and did the arithmetic on a paper napkin at the break-room table. $41,000, a 10-year-old truck belonging to her cousin Renata, no husband, no children, a mother in a care facility in another county who was comfortable and did not need tending more than 1 weekend a month. The arithmetic said she could try something or she could not, and the napkin went into her jacket pocket. She had found the listing for the Aldrich place, the way you find things when you are looking hard enough that the universe begins to feel pressured. In a 3-line notice in a farm auction, circular, she had picked up at a gas station at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, folded inside a seed catalog she had taken from the rack beside the register. The property was 80 acres in Cedar Bow Valley, a deteriorated farmstead with no working outbuildings, no functioning well house, and a reputation, the notice implied between its careful euphemisms, that had made the county land bank hold it for 2 years without a serious offer. The price was $22,000. She called the number that afternoon. She closed on it in 3 weeks. She drove into the valley in late February in gray snow, and the first thing she understood was that the land was tired in the way a person is tired who has been asked to do too much of the wrong things. The second thing she understood was that it was not ruined. Those are different conditions, and the difference is everything. She had budgeted the $41,000 as follows: $22,000 for the land, $4,000 for immediate structural repairs on the main house, and $15,000 remaining for livestock, feed, and operating. She had worked in frozen foods. She knew the processing end of poultry. She knew the margins that moved through a facility at scale, and she had decided on turkeys before she signed the deed. Decided on heritage breeds because the commodity market was glutted and the specialty market had room, and decided against waiting for spring because the Harwick County Fair auction ran every February, and she would not find the prices lower than at a winter sale of animals that nobody with an established operation wanted to carry through to spring. She arrived at the auction on the fourth Saturday of February with $15,000 in a bank draft, and found, as she had expected, that the heritage breed turkeys were the last lot of the morning and were drawing almost no interest. There were 160 birds, hens and toms, young of the year and breeders, 6 distinct bloodlines, including a strain of Narragansetts, that an old man in the front row said were the calmest birds he had ever seen, and then did not bid on them. She bid 4 times. She paid $6,040 for 160 turkeys. She loaded them in the wire crates she had rented from the farm supply and drove them home through the Gray Valley, and when she turned onto her road and the birds began settling in the crates, making a low, soft, chortling sound that was not distress but something like inquiry, she felt for the first time since she had written her arithmetic on a napkin that she might be doing the right thing. The community's verdict arrived faster than the cold broke. By the first week of March it was fully formed and widely circulated, and stated with the comfortable authority of people who have decided not to investigate. She was a city woman, she had bought worthless land in the wrong season, she had spent money she didn't have on birds that nobody wanted in a month, when feed costs would eat her alive before the birds ate anything themselves, and she would be gone before summer. This position was articulated most memorably and most publicly by a man named Gerald Ott, who ran the largest conventional turkey operation in the valley, 4,000 birds at a time in climate-controlled sheds on the North Ridge, and who encountered Marin at Harwick Feed and Grain on a Thursday morning in early March when she was pricing oyster shell and cracked corn. Gerald Ott was 51 years old and had a laugh that he used the way some men use a handshake, to establish something without saying it plainly. He laughed when he saw her order. He laughed again when he heard her name. He said that the Aldrich place had beaten 3 good men before her, and that 160 heritage birds in a valley that had no premium market was the kind of purchase that proved what he had always believed, which was that ambition without experience was just expensive, wishful thinking. He said it pleasantly, and there were 4 other men in the store who found it funny, and Myron paid for her order and had it loaded into the truck and drove home. She did not reply to him. Being right, she had learned by then, was going to be its own kind of answer. She just didn't know how long it would take. The first weeks were a full education in solitary difficulty. Her fencing was partial, and the birds needed rotation across pasture that was still half frozen, and she was up before light every morning to move panels and check water rurs that iced overnight and haul feed from the barn to the pens while the turkeys moved around her in the slow, deliberate way of animals that are watching you back. She kept a ledger in a composition notebook with columns for feed cost, bedding cost, mortality, weight estimate, and a 5th column she labeled simply days, which she incremented each morning as a reminder that what she was doing was accumulating something even when she could not see it. By the end of March, she had spent $2,400 on feed and lost 4 birds to a respiratory issue she treated with an old Extension Service protocol she found in a binder at the county library. By the end of April, the number in the days column was 61, and the birds were on pasture full time, and she was not losing money faster than she had projected, but she was not gaining anything visible either. The ledger was honest, and the ledger was grim. One evening she sat on an overturned feed bucket in the main pasture while the flock moved around her in the long April light, and she was holding the composition notebook and doing the arithmetic for the 7th time, and it said what it had said all 7 times, which was that she needed either revenue or time, and she was not sure she had enough of either, and she sat there long enough that the dominant tom A big Narragansett she had not yet named came and stood 4 feet from her and regarded her with the calm, flat intelligence of his kind. And she looked at him for a long time, and something in the quality of his stillness reminded her that she was not the only one waiting. Benedicta Soros came on a Saturday in the first week of May, walking down the road from the neighboring farm that shared Marin's western fence line, carrying a jar of something preserved and wearing rubber boots that had been patched many times. She was 78 years old, a woman who had come from the old country as a young wife and had outlasted her husband by 19 years, arriving as a young wife of perhaps 30 and farming alone since her late 50s. And 2 bad seasons that had taken most of their original flock, and she spoke with an accent that made her sentences arrive like water finding its own level, slowly, finding the shape of what they meant. She did not express surprise at the turkeys. She stood at the fence and looked at them for a while, and then she looked at Marin, and she said something that Marin wrote in the margin of her composition notebook that evening, and did not fully understand for another 6 weeks. She said, "The tree that wants to grow fast enough to shade the field tomorrow will crack its own root-reaching. The birds know where they are. You let them show you where the grass comes back first, and you will know something the rest of this county has forgotten." Then she gave Marin the jar, which was pickled green plums, and walked back up the road, and came back the following Saturday and the one after that, and she became, over the course of May and June, the only reliable company Marin had. The child arrived in May as well, not with an introduction, but with a simple material fact. Marin noticed him leaning on the fence post nearest the road one morning, watching the turkeys with the focused, unblinking attention of someone seeing something they have been looking for without knowing it. His name was Cody Pask, and he was 9 years old, and his family rented the small house at the bottom of Marin's Road, and he had 3 younger siblings and a father who worked irregular hours at the county gravel operation, and a mother who was managing carefully and without complaint. He said nothing the first 2 mornings. On the 3rd morning, Marin brought him inside the fence and handed him a feed bucket, and he took it and went to work. And by the end of the week, he was naming the birds. He named the big Narragansett Tom Sargent, and named the oldest hen Matilda, and named a small, nervous young Tom Pepper, and gave every bird he could reliably identify a name that seemed chosen by some system of observation she could not fully decode, but never found wrong. He did not go to school on Saturdays, and he came every Saturday and most mornings in June when school let out, and he never mocked the birds, and he never expressed doubt about the enterprise. And those 2 qualities made him better company than most adults Marin had met in the valley. What Benedicta had told her about watching the birds show her where the grass came back first turned out to be practical instruction rather than figure of speech. In the 2nd week of May, Marin began letting the flock range more widely across the eastern portion of the property instead of rotating them on the western pasture as she had been, following the pattern the birds themselves seemed to prefer, moving toward the low ground near the old creek cut at the property's edge where the soil was different, darker, cooler to the hand, and where the vegetation was noticeably more varied and dense than anywhere else on the 80 acres. The birds worked that ground with a systematic thoroughness that she began to understand was not random. They were finding insects, seeds, tubers, things the western pasture did not offer, and the nutrition was showing in their condition. By the 1st of June, what she had were the most robust, most fully feathered, most alert heritage turkeys she had ever seen at any processing facility, birds that moved with a kind of muscled ease that the commodity birds she had known had never possessed. And the composition notebook column for weight estimate was so far ahead of her projections that she checked it 3 times and went back to the references and checked those too. She was not imagining it. She was raising, without fully understanding how yet, something exceptional. She told no one. She kept that knowledge under wraps the way you keep a low coal banked under ash. patient, contained, ready, not yet a fire that anyone could see from the road. In late June, a man came to the valley in a white catering van with the name of a restaurant on the door, a restaurant in the city, 4 hours south, that had been written up in 2 publications Marin had read at the library while she was looking up the Extension Service protocols. He had come to the valley because he had heard from a farmer at a regional market that there were heritage turkeys somewhere in Cedarbow, and he had been looking for a reliable supply of quality birds that he could feature on a fall menu. His name was Dariush. He was the executive chef and part owner, and he walked into Marin's pasture in clean boots that were dirty within 10 minutes and spent 45 minutes watching the flock move and looking at individual birds. And then he looked at Marin with an expression that was not the expression anyone else in the county had used when looking at her, which was the expression of someone who has found the thing they were looking for. He asked her price. She told him she was not ready to sell yet, that the birds needed 2 more months on pasture, that she would have them ready for October processing and could offer him 40 birds at a price per pound she named, because she had done the arithmetic and knew what the arithmetic required. It was 4 times what commodity turkeys sold for. He said he would take 60, and could she commit to the same supply the following year? She said she would take that under consideration. He left his card and drove away, and Marin stood in the pasture with the composition notebook and wrote the number at the top of the days column, and then wrote the revenue figure beside it, and then sat down on the overturned feed bucket and let herself feel it quietly, the way you feel something you have been waiting for when it finally arrives. Not as excitement, but as a deep interior settling, like a post that has finally found the bottom of the post hole. She told Benedicta that Saturday. Benedicta looked at the figure in the notebook and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "The tree found enough root to reach the sun. Good. Tell no one else yet." She was right to say it, and Marin had already known it, and she did not tell anyone else. And through July and August, she continued to appear to the valley as what the valley had decided she was, a woman alone on a deteriorating property with a flock of unfashionable birds that any sensible person could see would never amount to anything. Gerald Ott, who drove past her road every Thursday morning on the way to his feed delivery, had twice slowed his truck to watch the pasture from the road and twice driven on without stopping. Fulton Greer from the Regional Cooperative had come to her gate in July with a card and a proposal she did not invite him inside to finish, an acquisition offer for the flock at commodity price plus a 10% goodwill adjustment, framed as a kindness given her situation. She told him she would keep that in mind. He told her the offer had a shelf life and smiled warmly and drove away in a truck that cost more than her land. The heat came in August and did not leave in September and was still present in October in a way that was wrong in every register, ecological and agricultural and deeply personal to people whose grandparents had told them what October in the valley was supposed to feel like. The creek that ran through the north end of the valley, the one that Gerald Ott's operation depended on for its cooling and its processing water, dropped to a trickle by the second week of September. The wells that served the conventional operations on the ridge began pulling sand by the end of that month. Gerald Ott's sheds, which required a specific temperature range and a specific water volume to maintain 4,000 commodity birds through a cycle, began failing to hold temperature and then began failing to hold birds, and by the first week of October he had lost 900 birds to heat stress and water insufficiency, and the cost arithmetic of the operation had become a figure that made the composition notebook look like abundance. 3 other conventional turkey operations in the county were in similar condition. The specialty crop farmers were struggling. The orchard on the South Road lost a third of its apple harvest to an October condition that nobody had a word for because it had not happened before. Marin's flock was fine. They were on the creek-cut ground that did not depend on the ridge wells, on the low land where the soil held moisture longer, and the varied forage that had built their condition over 7 months had produced birds with a physiological resilience that the commodity stock raised on feed and climate control rather than on land and foraging simply did not have. She lost 3 birds in October to the heat. She still had 153 turkeys, accounting for the 4 lost in March and no further mortality since, down from 160 by 3 losses in October and 4 in March, and the birds otherwise intact, most of them in the finest condition of their lives, 30 days from processing. In a county where the conventional operators had been devastated and where the regional cooperatives' contracted supply for Thanksgiving fulfillment was short by a figure that Fulton Greer understood would cost him the kind of accounts that do not come back once they leave. Cody came to her on the second Saturday of October and reported in the flat observational tone he used for everything that there were more trucks slowing down on the road than usual. She had noticed. She had also noticed that Fulton Greer had driven past twice in 1 week, which was more than his normal pattern, and that on the second pass he had a passenger she did not recognize who appeared to be taking notes. She noted this in the composition notebook and said nothing publicly, and let the coal stay banked under its ash. Gerald Ott came to her gate on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of October and did not have his laugh with him. He was a large man, and he stood at the gate with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at the pasture, and then at his boots, and then at Marin, and he said that he was in a difficult situation, and that he understood she had birds in good condition, and that he was hoping she might be willing to discuss supply at a price that would be fair to both parties. He said the word fair with the care of a man who is using a word he has not often needed to mean what it says. She did not point out what he had said in the feed store in March. She did not need to. He remembered it. She could see that in the quality of his difficulty. She told him she had a prior commitment on 60 birds, and that she was considering her options on the remaining stock, and that she would let him know. She said it without unkindness and without satisfaction in her voice, though she allowed herself something small and private on the inside, the way you allow yourself to breathe out after holding your breath for 8 months. The community meeting was called by Fulton Greer and framed as an emergency regional coordination session, which was a precise description in the same way that a wolf in a field is a precise description that leaves out what the wolf is doing there. He had reserved the community hall for a Tuesday evening and had reached out to every farm operation in the valley and to several outside buyers, and to the county agricultural extension office, and to Marin, whom he called the morning of the meeting with the warm, smooth voice he kept ready for situations like this, and told her that the community was hoping she would attend and that there might be an opportunity worth discussing. She said she would be there. She brought the composition notebook. She sat near the window. He went through the regional numbers first, and the numbers were bad and honestly presented, because the numbers served his purpose. 9 conventional operations in the county had sustained major losses. The regional cooperative's Thanksgiving commitment was short by approximately 4,000 birds against contracted demand. The processing window was 17 days away, and the only intact heritage flock in the valley, 153 birds on the Aldrich Place, was insufficient to fill that gap entirely, but was critical to any partial solution. Then he described his proposal, which was acquisition of the flock at a price he named, a price that was above commodity and below what Dariush had already paid per pound, and which he described as the best possible outcome for the community given the circumstances, and he said the word community 6 times in 4 sentences in a way that meant the cooperative's quarterly contract obligations. Then he invited Marin to speak. She stood up. She was not a practiced speaker, and she did not try to be one. She said that she appreciated the invitation and that she had a question before the discussion went further. She said that she had noted in her records that a visitor to her property in the 2nd week of October had estimated her remaining flock at 148 birds. She said that she found this interesting because she had not provided that number to anyone, and her own count at that date had been 153, and she wondered whether Mr. Greer could help her understand how that particular figure had been arrived at by a person taking notes in a truck on a public road. The room was quiet. Fulton Greer's smile remained in place for approximately 4 seconds after the words landed, which was 2 seconds longer than a genuine smile can hold against a question it cannot answer. He said he wasn't sure what she was referring to. She said she thought he might be sure, and she sat back down, and the room, which had been watching Fulton Greer with varying degrees of trust up to that moment, turned to look at him with a different quality of attention. She let the silence do its work for a moment. Then she stood again and said that she had a different proposal for the community's consideration, and she asked that Fulton Greer sit down, which he did, because in that moment the room's power had shifted to the window, and everyone in the room understood it. She said that she had a prior commitment for 60 birds at a price she had agreed to and intended to honor. She said that of the remaining 93 birds, that being 153 less the 60 committed to Darius, she was prepared to make them available to Valley Farms and families for Thanksgiving, at a price that she was going to state in a specific way. She would charge the actual cost of feed, bedding, and direct labor for those birds, which she had calculated in her composition notebook down to the dollar, divided across the 93 head, which came to $19.40 per bird live weight, and that she would process them at that price at the county co-op facility, and that the only condition was that no bird could be resold to a wholesale buyer, because these were for Valley households and Valley farms that had been hurt by the drought, not for anyone's contract fulfillment. She looked at Fulton Greer when she said contract fulfillment. She looked at the room when she said Valley households. She sat down. There was a long pause of the kind that fills up with people doing arithmetic in their heads and comparing it to the arithmetic in their hearts and finding that for once the two columns match. Gerald Ott, who was sitting 3 rows from the front and had said nothing since the meeting began, stood up without being invited to, took his cap off, and held it in front of him with both hands, and said that he owed her an apology that was about 8 months overdue, and that he was glad to accept her offer and would be first in line for birds if she would have him, and he sat back down. Several other people spoke. Fulton Greer attempted twice to reintroduce his proposal and was not engaged by the room either time. By the end of the meeting he had gathered his clipboard and his proposals and walked out through the side door with the deliberate pace of a man who wants to appear unhurried and is not succeeding. No one moved to stop him or to follow. The cooperative would renegotiate its contracts without the Valley's help and find it a harder Valley to enter the following year, but that reckoning belonged to time and to the market, and not to this room and not to this evening. Benedicta was not at the meeting. She was 78, and she did not attend meetings as a rule, but she was at Marin's gate the following Saturday morning in her patched rubber boots with another jar of something preserved, green tomatoes this time, and she listened while Marin described what had happened, and then she was quiet for a while in the way she was quiet when she was assembling language for something she thought mattered. She said, "You found what the land was keeping for you, and then you gave it back. That is the whole lesson, and most people never learn the first part, let alone the second." Then she looked at the pasture where Sargent still moved, the big Narragansett Tom, who had been held back from the sale lot because Marin and Cody had agreed, without discussing it explicitly, that he was not for selling, and she said, "That one knows. He always knew you were listening." Cody was at the fence beside Marin, and he was watching Sargent move across the morning pasture with the long, particular attention he gave to things he understood were important. And he said, without looking away from the bird, "He told me in April that you were going to be okay." He said it in the flat, observational tone he used for everything, and neither woman asked him to explain how he had received this information, because both of them had spent enough time in that pasture to understand that the communication had probably been accurate. The rains came in the second week of November, not gently, but with the full recovered intention of a sky that has been holding back for too long. And the creek on the north end came up, and the valley began, slowly, to lose the parched quality it had worn all fall like a coat it could not take off. The Aldrich place, which the valley had called the Aldrich place for 30 years through 3 failed owners, began to be called Marin's place in conversation, not ceremonially but simply, the way a name becomes a name, because it reflects a fact that everyone has accepted. The 80 acres were hers, and the land was already different from what it had been in February. The eastern creek-cut ground had been worked by 160 birds for 9 months, and it had been improved by that work in ways that would compound across seasons. The composition notebook showed at the close of the year that she had cleared $11,000 after all costs, had an agreement with Darius for 60 birds the following year at a price they had renegotiated upward given the fall's events, and had a waiting list of 7 valley families for next Thanksgiving's remaining stock at a price she intended to set fairly and would set after doing the arithmetic in full. She had enough in the operating account to carry the flock through winter and to begin planning for a second generation of breeders in the spring. She had enough to stay. She was sitting on the overturned feed bucket one evening in late November, the composition notebook on her knee, when she became aware that she had not thought about the ledger or the arithmetic or the days column for several hours, had been sitting in the pasture simply because she wanted to be there, because it was the place she was from now, which is a different thing from the place you arrived at. The valley was quiet, and the creek was running again, and the remaining birds were settling for the night in the low ground they had chosen for themselves back in May, when they first showed her where the grass came back first. She looked at the notebook and looked at the pasture and thought about what Benedicta had said, which was not a lesson about turkeys or about drought or about defeating a man with a clipboard and a warm handshake, but about what it means to find what the land is keeping for you and to understand that the finding and the giving back are the same motion, the way breathing in and breathing out are not 2 actions, but one continuous thing that only seems to have a direction. She wrote nothing in the notebook that evening. She let the field speak, and she was quiet enough to hear it, and what it said was, "You are here now, and here is a place that keeps faith with what is patient and what is honest. And it kept faith with you, and now you keep faith with it. And that is how a person comes to belong somewhere that did not know her name 8 months ago, and will not forget it now." Sargent crossed the pasture in the last light, moving with the slow, enormous dignity of a creature that has never doubted its own purpose, and he passed within 2 feet of her as he had passed within 2 feet of her on that April evening when she was doing the arithmetic for the 7th time on the overturned feed bucket in the failing light, and she thought that Cody was probably right, that he had known something then that she was only catching up to now. She put the notebook in her jacket pocket. She stayed in the pasture a while longer because there was nowhere she needed to be except exactly where she was, and that, she thought, was the whole arithmetic of it arrived at last, balancing out.